Brutal punishments. Throughout time and history, almost every civilization ever has utilized some sort of torture method to either punish someone, interrogate someone, or just to kill someone in a very brutal way. And yeah, I'm pretty aware that this iceberg as a whole is pretty morbid, dark, and gruesome, but I'll try my best to not over-exaggerate what happens in the methods, but still try my best to portray and tell about the facts and what really happened and happens. Some of these torture methods may be psychological, physical, or somewhere in between, but every single one on the iceberg has been used sometime in history and to someone. And disclaimer, of course, this video will talk about some pretty disturbing, gross, and just, dark things. But I'll skip a few of these because they are so gross and disturbing that they would get the video age restricted. And I wish I didn't have to skip them, but that's the way it is. And with that out of the way, let's get into the brutal punishments iceberg. And actually, before we get into the video, consider subscribing. It's my goal to be at 50,000 subscribers before the end of the year, and we are so close to reaching it, so consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind. And now, let's get into the video. Alright, now on to tier 1, starting with torture methods that are psychological or have just a low probability of death, and starting with white room torture. And this is a form of psychological torture aimed at a complete sensory deprivation and isolation. The practice involves depriving a prisoner of their sensory experiences in various different ways, such as visual deprivation through an all-white cell, auditory deprivation through soundproofing, and a loss of taste, smell, and tactile sensations through specific conditions. The effects of white torture, as mentioned, can be severe and include depersonalization, hallucinations, and even psychotic breaks. The use of the techniques in detention and interrogation has been the subject of ethical and human rights concerns, as it can lead to severe psychological distress and is often considered a form of inhumane treatment or torture. Solitary confinement is a contentious practice employed within the prison systems, involving the isolation of a prisoner in a small cell for extended periods of time, typically ranging from 22 to 24 hours a day. During this time, inmates experience minimal human contact and limited environmental stimulation. This practice is utilized for a variety of different reasons, including disciplinary measures for rule violations, the protection of vulnerable inmates, and the isolation of those with a history of violent behavior or involvement in gang activities. In the context of solitary confinement, prisoners are confined to small cells, often devoid of windows and personal belongings. The conditions are characterized by limited social interaction and a strict adherence to rules and regulations. Prolonged isolation in these conditions have been detrimental effects on the inmate's mental health, leading to severe psychological stress, anxiety, depression, hallucinations, and self-harm. Tragically, solitary confinement has also been associated with a heightened risk of S-word among inmates. The practice of solitary confinement remains a subject of ongoing debate within the criminal justice systems. Critics argue that it may constitute cruel and unusual punishment, and while proponents maintain that it is necessary to maintain order and safety within correctional facilities. Injection of psychotropic drugs. The injection of psychotropic drugs refers to the administration of medications that affect the mind, emotions, or behaviors through intravenous, intramuscular, or subcutaneous injection. These drugs are often used to treat various mental health conditions, including psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and severe depression, among others. In some cases, these injections may have been administered as a form of chemical restraint in psychiatric and correctional settings to manage aggressive or agitated behavior. Psychotropic drugs, also just known as psychiatric medications, can be an essential component of mental health treatment. They aim to alleviate symptoms and involve the quality of life of individuals with mental illnesses. Depending on the specific drug, the patient's condition, and the healthcare provider's judgment, these medications can be administered orally, intravenously, intramuscularly, or subcutaneously. In some situations, intramuscular or intravenous injections of psychotropic drugs may be employed in emergencies to quickly calm or sedate a person who is experiencing extreme agitation, aggression, or psychosis. Tickle torture is a form of physical discomfort or psychological torment in which an individual is subjected to tickling, often against their will, to induce laughter and discomfort. It is usually not intended to cause physical harm, but rather to exploit the subject's sensitivity to tickling sensations, and the act of tickling can be experienced as pleasurable by some, but also highly uncomfortable or even painful by others, so it has been used as a form of torture before. So, just tickling torture. Hooding, in the context of human rights and security practices, refers to the act of placing a hood or sack over a person's head, often as part of a process of restraint, interrogation, or detention. Hooding can be used as a means of sensory deprivation, disorientation, and to induce fear or anxiety. It has been employed by some military and law enforcement organizations during detention and interrogation processes. Hooding has been subject of controversy and ethical debate because it can lead to psychological stress and discomfort, and there has been instances where it has been associated with abuse and torture. Hamstringing is a historical context is a practice with significant ethical and moral implications. This term refers to the brutal and inhumane act of intentionally cutting or damaging the hamstring tendons in a person's legs. It has been used as a form of punishment or torture in various historical and cultural settings, often against prisoners or slaves. The act of hamstringing inflicts severe and lasting physical harm on individuals, causing extreme pain and a profound loss of mobility. Riding the rail is a historical punishment or humiliation technique that was used in some cultures, particularly during the colonial period in North America. This practice involved punishing individuals by making them sit astride a fence rail or a sharp wooden beam, often with their hands tied behind their back. The person was then lifted and carried by others, who would then march or walk around, and sometimes parading the individual through a town or community. The purpose of riding the rail was typically to publicly shame or punish individuals for perceived wrongdoings or breaches of social norms. It was often employed as a form of community-based justice or punishment for minor offenses, such as petty theft, adultery, or public drunkenness. The physical discomfort, exposure, and humiliation associated with riding the rail made it particularly effective means of punishment and public humiliation. It was meant to serve as a deterrent and to send a strong message to others about the consequences of breaking societal norms. Chinese water torture is a term that was used to describe a method of torture or psychological torment. The practice involves dripping water onto a person's forehead over an extended period, usually with a single droplet at a time. While this may not cause physical harm or pain, it can lead to severe psychological distress. The idea behind this method is to create a sense of helplessness or anxiety over time, as the continuous, monotonous dripping of water can be maddening. The person subjected to this treatment may become increasingly agitated, anxious, and stressed due to the relentless, rhythmic nature of the water drops. Sensory deprivation is a practice that involves intentionally reducing or eliminating sensory input to one or more of the five senses: sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. This is typically done by creating an environment in which these sensory inputs are minimized or controlled. Sensory deprivation can take several different forms, such as isolation tanks, sensory deprivation chambers, or the use of blindfolds and earplugs. It is used for various different purposes, including relaxation, stress reduction, and meditation. And it can also be used as torture sometimes, I guess, because if you end up having sensory deprivation for a long and prolonged period, then it can cause psychological effects, including hallucinations and altered time perception. And its ethical use is the subject of consideration, particularly in the context where it may cause distress or coercion, because if you're forced to have sensory deprivation instead of doing it as a meditative way, then you kind of go crazy because you can't feel anything, and then you just kind of lose your mind. Exposure to extreme elements. These are pretty, obvious, self-explanatory, but these include exposing individuals to extreme temperatures as a historical method of torture or punishment has taken different forms, with instances of immersing victims in freezing water, subjecting them to extreme cold conditions, branding with hot irons, forcing them to walk off planks into cold or shark-infested waters, and suspending them over open flames or in hot iron cages. These cruel practices, whether inflicting extreme cold or heat, cause severe physical suffering, frostbite, hypothermia, burns, and in some cases, death. Waterboarding is a controversial and widely condemned interrogation and torture technique because it is actually often used by different organizations and involves restraining a person and simulating the sensation of drowning by pouring or dripping water over a cloth or plastic wrap placed over the face. This method creates a feeling of suffocation, intense fear, and a sense of imminent death, often causing extreme distress, and waterboarding has been used as an interrogation technique in various historical and contemporary contexts, particularly during times of conflict or war. It has been criticized on ethical and human rights grounds and is considered a form of torture by many international organizations and governments. Branding. Human branding, historically and in some contemporary contexts, involves marking a person's skin with a distinctive symbol, design, or mark using heat, chemicals, or other various methods. It has been employed for a range of different purposes, including as a form of punishment for convicts and criminals, as a means of identifying and establishing ownership of slaves, or as part of cultural or religious rituals, and more recently for personal or aesthetic expression, often referred to as scarification. Sleep deprivation has been employed as a method of torture and coercion in various historical and contemporary contexts. This practice involves deliberately preventing an individual from obtaining adequate sleep for extended periods, and it can cause major psychological distress. Methods used to induce sleep deprivation include forced wakefulness, exposure to continuous light or noise, physical discomfort, and psychological stress, and the effects of sleep deprivation can be debilitating, leading to hallucinations, cognitive impairment, severe fatigue, and even mental breakdown. And it has been used in interrogations as a form of punishment or to extract information. Shaming torture, sometimes referred to just as public shaming or humiliation, is a form of torture or punishment that involves subjecting an individual to public disgrace, ridicule, or humiliation. This practice is designed to cause severe emotional and psychological distress by exposing an individual's perceived wrongdoings or alleged transgressions to a public audience. And this one has already kind of been mentioned, so I'll keep it short with riding the rail, which was kind of the exact same as this, but that's basically all this is. Scold's bridle, also just known as the branks, was a historically used instrument of punishment, primarily in Europe, during the medieval and early modern periods. It was typically used on women who were accused of being scolds or gossips. The scold's bridle was a metal muzzle that enclosed the head of the wearer, featuring a flat plate that covered the tongue. A spike or plate with a small hole was often placed inside the mouth, making it impossible for the person to speak clearly or eat. The purpose of the scold's bridle was to punish and publicly shame women who were seen as disruptive, argumentative, or engaged in gossip or slander. It was often used as a means of social control, as those who wore it would be paraded through the streets or placed in the public square, where they would be subjected to further ridicule and humiliation. Confinement in small places is a form of physical torture or punishment that involves forcibly placing an individual in a very restricted or confined area with limited or no room for movement. This practice is designed to induce severe discomfort, anxiety, and distress due to the tight claustrophobic environment. Confinement in small spaces can take various forms, such as locking a person in a tiny cell, a coffin-sized box, or even a small cage. Pitch capping is a historical form of punishment or torture that was used in some cultures, particularly during the medieval period. This method involved covering a person's head with a cap or hood made of tar or pitch, which is a sticky, black, and highly flammable substance derived from coal or wood. The purpose of pitch capping was to publicly shame, punishment, or intimidate individuals who were accused of various offenses, including theft, fraud, or other crimes. The tar or pitch was often heated and then poured over the individual's head or applied directly to the cap. As it cooled and solidified, the victim would be left with a heavy, pitch-covered headgear that was both uncomfortable and humiliating. In some cases, the tar-soaked cap would be set on fire briefly, adding an additional layer of torment and danger to the punishment. The individual would then be paraded through the town or a public square as a means of public humiliation. Alright, now on to Tier 2, and these entries and methods of torture can lead to death, but most of the time just severe injuries, so these are pretty, obviously serious, these are all serious, but these are a little less serious because they don't always lead to death. Alright, starting off with the iron spider, also known as the breast ripper, and the iron spider would have been attached to a wall and the woman's breasts were fixed onto the claws of the tool, and the woman was then pulled away from the wall, tearing off her breasts. Another variant of this included spiked bars asphyxiated slightly away from the wall, and the woman would have been pulled along the bars until her breasts were ripped off. Starting off with the tough one. Deprivation of food. A cruel and inhumane form of torture inflicts severe physical and psychological suffering on victims. Prolonged lack of food leads to physical consequences such as malnutrition, weakness, muscle wasting, organ damage, and potentially death. The psychological impact includes anxiety, depression, and profound distress, eroding the victim's sense of hope and dignity. In some cases, authorities employ forced feedings, inserting tubes into the victim's stomachs to provide nutrition against their will. This form of abuse is used in prisons, detention centers, and especially against political prisoners, violating fundamental human rights and international law. Bone breaking, often referred to as bone crushing or just as bone breaking, is a brutal form of torture involving the intentional breaking of an individual's bones through techniques like blunt force, extreme pressure, or the use of tools, typically targeting fingers, toes, limbs, and ribs. This inhumane practice inflicts excruciating physical pain, resulting in fractures, dislocations, and potential long-term disabilities, while also causing severe psychological trauma, including extreme fear and PTSD in victims. Use of castor oil. The misuse of castor oil as a form of torture and punishment historically involved the forced ingestion of large quantities of castor oil against the victim's will, leading to severe physical and psychological suffering. Castor oil's potent laxative properties, when ingested in excess, induced uncontrollable diarrhea, agonizing abdominal cramps, and dehydration. Victims subjected to castor oil torture experienced intense physical pain, humiliation, and fear as the rapid and uncontrollable bowel movements caused by the oil proved deeply traumatic and degrading. Denailing, often referred to as nail extraction or fingernail torture, is a brutal and painful form of torture involving the forcible removal of an individual's fingernails or toenails. Torturers employ sharp tools like pliers to carry out this traumatic and agonizing process, inflicting intense physical and psychological suffering on their victims. The physical consequences of denailing are excruciating, leading to pain, bleeding, and an alleviated risk of infection, potentially resulting in long-term damage and disfigurement. This method of torture also leaves deep psychological scars, causing extreme fear, distress, and enduring trauma, often resulting in PTSD. The heretic's fork is a historical instrument of torture that was used during medieval period in Europe, particularly during the Inquisition. It consists of a metal fork with two prongs attached to a leather strap. This cruel device was designed to be inserted into the victim's mouth, with one prong placed under the chin and the other on the chest or throat. The leather strap secured it into place, preventing the victim from sleeping or lowering their head. Any attempt to do so would result in painful puncture wounds to the throat or the chest, making it an excruciating instrument of torture. The heretic's fork was primarily used to extract confessions of heresy or other crimes from the victim, and it symbolizes the brutality of the medieval justice system, especially during religious persecutions. Deprivation of drink, also known as water torture or water deprivation, is a deeply cruel and inhumane form of torture that involves deliberately withholding water or fluids from an individual, which is pretty self-explanatory, and it causes really bad psychological problems and severe consequences to the physical body, such as a dry mouth, cracked lips, weakness, organ damage, and in extreme cases, death. Cutting. And this one is also pretty self-explanatory just from the name, and I really couldn't even find anything online about like a use of this in history at some point, but cutting, which is cutting someone and causing pain. Combing, also known just as carding, and it is sometimes a fatal form of torture in which iron combs designed to prepare wool and other fibers for woolen spinning are used to scrape, tear, or flay the victim's flesh. So basically it's just a kind of comb, obviously from the name, or brush that is made out of metal, and you just scraped against your skin and obviously tears off your skin. So pretty bad stuff. Mutilation encompasses deliberate acts of inflicting severe physical harm or disfigurement on an individual, often with an intent of causing pain, incapacitation, or punishment. These practices vary widely and have been employed in various different reasons throughout history and across different cultures. Common forms of mutilation include amputation, branding, saccharification, genital mutilation, binding, and practices like tongue splitting. While some may have cultural, religious, or traditional significance, many forms of mutilation are performed without consent and are considered a violation of human rights, making them illegal under international law, and it really messes up, obviously, the people subject to the torture. Force-feeding salt and water is a perilous and harmful practice involving the administration of excessive quantities of these substances, which is salt and water, to an individual against their will, often as a means of torture or punishment. The impact on the body can be severe, with an excessive intake of salt leading to hypertonemia, characterized by elevated sodium levels in the blood and symptoms like extreme thirst, dehydration, confusion, seizures, and even organ failure or death. Conversely, the forced indigestion of large amounts of water can result in water intoxication or hypothermia. Beatings involve the use of physical force to strike or inflict harm upon an individual, typically through repeated blows, punches, or strikes with various objects. Beating, as a form of violence or punishment, can cause severe physical injury and psychological trauma to the victim. Now onto tier 3, and these will all most likely end in death, and so from here on out these will be insanely brutal. I mean, the ones before this have been brutal, but I mean these all, from here on out will all end in death, so these are really bad. And starting with dragging torture, also known as the death march or forced marches, is a brutal form of torture or punishment in which individuals are forcibly compelled to march long distances under extreme and life-threatening conditions. Victims endure the practice to inflict both severe physical and psychological suffering upon them. Typically, victims are forced to walk long distances in harsh weather conditions, often without adequate access to food, water, or rest. They may also face physical abuse, beatings, or other forms of mistreatment throughout the march. The physical consequences of dragging torture can be dire, including exhaustion, dehydration, malnutrition, injuries, and in some cases, death, as victims are pushed beyond their physical limits. Flagellation, commonly known as whipping or flogging, is a practice involving the striking of a person's body, often the back with a whip, lash, or similar instrument. Historically, flagellation has been employed across various different cultures and eras as a means of punishment, religious penance, or initiation into specific groups or societies. In some religious traditions, flagellation is incorporated as a form of self-mortification during specific rituals or ceremonies to demonstrate devotion or seek spiritual purification. However, flagellation can result in physical injuries, including cuts, bruises, welts, and in severe cases, permanent scarring or injury, and the psychological impact can be significant, encompassing trauma, humiliation, and fear, particularly when it is used as a form of punishment or abuse. Oxygen deprivation can be used as a torture method, and this can be employed as a form of torture or punishment, which can involve methods like suffocation, drowning, or exposure to harmful gases, resulting in severe physical and psychological suffering. Sharpened bamboo sticks underneath fingernails. The horrifying practice of inserting sharpened bamboo sticks or similar objects underneath an individual's fingernails is a brutal and painful form of torture, deliberately employed to inflict extreme pain and suffering. This method involves torturers forcibly pushing sharpened bamboo sticks, nails, or other sharp objects beneath the victim's fingernails, causing excruciating pain and potential injury. The physical consequences are profound, including intense pain, damage to the fingernails, and the possibility of lasting harm to the fingers. The ducking stool, often referred to as the cucking stool, is a historical instrument or punishment and public humiliation that was prevalent in medieval and early modern Europe. This contraption typically consisted of a chair or board mounted on a long wooden or metal arm affixated to a pivoted point near a body of water. Accused individuals, often women facing allegations of being a scold or a nag, were placed on a stool. The process involved dunking the person into a nearby body of water, such as a pond or river, using ropes or pulleys. This humiliating ritual aimed to subject the accused to the public ridicule and punishment. The ducking stool was employed to punish perceived offenses, including scolding, witchcraft accusations, and various moral transgressions. It served as a means to shame and silence those who did not conform to societal norms. In contemporary times, the use of the ducking stool is viewed as inhumane and unjust, and no one uses it anymore for pretty obvious reasons. Electric shock torture is a cruel and painful form of torture that involves administering an electric shock to an individual's body. This practice is employed to inflict severe physical and psychological suffering on the victim. Electric shock torture can be carried out using various different devices, such as stun guns, tasers, or improvised electrical equipment to deliver electrical currents to the victim's body. The physical consequences of this torture can be excruciating, resulting in burns, muscle contractions, and in severe cases, even cardiac arrest or death. Beyond the physical pain, the psychological trauma inflicted by electrical shock is profound, with victims experiencing extreme fear, distress, and enduring lasting emotional trauma. Strappado is a historical method of torture characterized by the suspension of an individual from their tightly bound wrists, typically positioned beyond their back, and this painful practice inflicts extreme strain on the victim's shoulders, arms, and wrists by hoisting them off the ground using a pulley or rope system, and the physical consequences of the strappado are grave, leading to dislocated shoulders, torn ligaments, broken bones, and enduring physical injuries, often accompanied by excruciating pain. Equally profound is the psychological impact, as victims experience the intense fear of suspension and the resulting agony, which can cause lasting emotional trauma. Historically, strappado was employed as a means of torture during various eras and in diverse cultures, particularly in the context of political conflict, inquisition, and warfare. Garrote, or strangulation, is a gruesome act of involving the deliberate application of pressure to an individual's neck with intent to cut off their air supply and blood flow. This form of violence can be executed using various means, including bare hands, ropes, cords, belts, or other objects, to constrict the victim's neck and block the airway, leading to asphyxiation. Water cure, also just known as waterboarding, is a historical method of torture or interrogation that involves forcibly immobilizing the victim, often by strapping them to a board with their head lower than their feet. A cloth or plastic wrap is placed over the victim's face and water is poured onto it, covering the nose and mouth. And while water is not ingested, the sensation of drowning is induced and leading to intense panic, fear, and the feeling of suffocation. And we've already kind of covered this earlier with waterboarding, so this one's pretty redundant in the Iceberg, but whatever, I just covered it real quick. Alright, now on to tier 4, and these will all definitely end in death. So these are all insanely brutal from here on out. And starting off with crucifixion. This is a harrowing historical method of execution and torture that involves the victim being firmly attached to a wooden cross. typically with nails driven through their wrists and feet. Subsequently, they are hoisted onto the cross, which is erected into an upright position, and this cruel practice inflicts intense physical suffering, including excruciating pain, asphyxiation due to the pressure on the chest, exposure to the elements, and the risk of shock or organ failure. Death in crucifixion is often slow and agonizing. Historically, crucifixion was employed as a method of execution and torture, notably by the Roman Empire, as a brutal form of public punishment. Beyond its historical significance, crucifixion carries profound religious importance, particularly in Christian theology, as it is famously associated with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Dry boarding is a torture method that induces the early stages of death by asphyxiation. Unlike waterboarding, where water is poured on a wet cloth placed over a subject's airways, causing a sensation of drowning, dry boarding induces asphyxiation by stuffing the victim's airways with rags and taping their mouth and nose shut. This method has actually been associated with interrogation techniques used by the United States during the War on Terror, with both the CIA and the military agents describing it as one of the enhanced interrogation techniques. Starvation, and after this will also be dehydration, which are two in the same tier, which are in these, and I'm not going to really go that in depth about starvation and dehydration, and because they're pretty self-explanatory. Starvation is just getting rid of food for someone. Dehydration is just getting rid of water for someone. And that's it. The brazen bull is a gruesome and legendary torture device from ancient Greece. It was invented by the craftsman named Parallos of Athens during the 6th century BC. The brazen bull was used as a means of executing criminals, political dissidents, and enemies of the state. A condemned person would be placed inside the bull through a door on the side. The bull had a series of tubes and pipes that allowed the torturers to create a system where the victim's screams would be transformed into the sound of a bull's roar, amplifying the horror of the situation. As a fire was lit underneath the bull, the metal would slowly heat up and the victim inside would slowly roast to death. The bull's design was also included a system to ensure that the person's death was prolonged and painful. The smoke and hot air from the fire would exit through the bull's nostrils, further enhancing the illusion that the bull itself was alive. The brazen bull was not only a method of execution, but also a form of psychological torture, as the condemned person could see and hear the reactions of the spectators outside the bull. It was meant to be a terrifying and public spectacle intended to discourage others from engaging in criminal or seditious behaviors. The Iron Maiden is another infamous torture device from history. It is coffin-like, upright cabinet made of iron or wood, with an interior lined with spikes or metal blades. The victim was enclosed inside, and the doors or lid would be shut, causing the spikes to penetrate the body, inflicting severe pain and often leading to a slow and agonizing death. The exact origins and historical accuracy of the Iron Maiden are a subject of debate among historians. Some believe that it was a real torture device used during the medieval and early modern periods, while others argue that it might be more of a myth or misinterpretation of historical records. There are accounts of similar devices being used for torture in various parts of Europe during the Middle Ages. Whether or not the Iron Maiden was a widely used torture device, it has become a symbol of the cruelty and brutality of the medieval torture methods. It is often depicted in literature, art, and popular culture as a gruesome and terrifying instrument of torment. Cement shoes is a term used to describe a particularly gruesome method of murder associated with organized crime. The practice involves binding a person's feet and sometimes hands and then encasing them into a block of concrete or cement. The victim, often still alive when placed in this situation, would be thrown into a body of water, typically a river or the ocean. The cement would quickly harden, making it nearly impossible for the person to free themselves or escape. This method of disposing of a person's body is meant to both ensure their death and make it difficult for law enforcement to locate their remains. The term cement shoes is often used in reference to mafia or organized crime activities, and it has been popularized in various movies, TV shows, and crime novels. Hung, drawn, and quartered is a gruesome method of execution that was used in England and some other parts of Europe primarily during this medieval period and to a limited extent in the early modern era. This form of execution was reserved for individuals convicted of high treason, which often included crimes like plotting against the monarchy or the state. The process of being hung, drawn, and quartered typically involved the following steps. Step 1 being hung. The condemned person was hanged, but not to the point of death. They would be strangled and then cut down while still alive, and the second step being drawn. After being cut down, the person would be emasculated, which means their genitals would be removed and then disemboweled while still alive. This was a particularly brutal and agonizing step. And number 3, quartered. Finally, the person's body would be divided into 4 parts, often symbolizing the severity of the punishment for high treason. These body parts, typically the limbs, were then displayed publicly in different locations as a gruesome warning to others. This form of execution was designed to be extremely painful and humiliating. Crushing can refer to different various contexts, but in the context of the punishment or execution, it typically means a method of causing death or inflicting severe harm by applying intense pressure or force. This form of execution is often used as a form of capital punishment in history or as a method of torture. One historical example of crushing as a method of execution is pressing. In this method, a person was placed under a heavy weight, often a large stone or a board with heavy objects on top, and over time, the weight would gradually increase, causing severe pain and eventually leading to death. Another form of crushing as method of execution is the breaking wheel, or Catherine wheel. This involved tying the victim to a large wheel and then breaking their limbs with a heavy iron bar. The victims would be left on the wheel to die, sometimes over a period of days. Crushing as a form of torture can also involve other methods, such as crushing the fingers or toes with vices or using devices like the thumb screw. Flaying, also just known as skinning, is a gruesome and brutal method of torture and execution involving the removal of a person's skin from their body. It has been used as a form of punishment, torture, or execution in various historical contexts. The victim would be restrained and then clothes would be removed. Torturers or executioners would then use knives, blades, or other sharp instruments to carefully cut away the victim's skin, often starting from the extremities, such as the fingers and toes, and working towards the torso. The process was slow and agonizing, and victims would usually die from shock, blood loss, or infection during or after the flaying. Flaying was often used as a form of punishment in some societies for certain crimes, often as a means to set an example and deter others from similar actions. In some cases, it was used against individuals considered to be political enemies or threats to those in power. One of the most infamous historical examples of flaying is associated with the Aztec civilization in Mesoamerica, where it was used as a form of human sacrifice during religious rituals. Aztec priests would flay the skin of sacrificial victims, often wearing the skin themselves or using it to create clothing or ceremonial objects. Stoning. Stoning is a form of execution in which a group of people throw stones at an individual until they are killed. This brutal method of execution has been used historically in various parts of the world, often as a form of punishment for crimes such as adultery, blasphemy, or apostasy. Stoning is intended to be painful, humiliating, and public form of execution. The process of stoning typically involves the following steps. The condemned person is buried up to their chest for men or up to their neck for women in a pit or a hole in the ground. The depth of the burial can vary by region and legal or cultural norms. A crowd or group of people, often including family members of the victim, gather around the condemned person. The crowd then pelts the person with stones, aiming for the head and upper body. The stones are usually of a size that can cause harm, but are not so large as to kill the person instantly. The stoning continues until the person is pronounced dead, which can take a very long time and is often a gruesome and painful process. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, and I went over this a little bit earlier in that tier, but I'll just cover it more in depth right now, was a gruesome and torturous execution method used in Europe during the late Middle Ages during the late modern period. It was primarily used as a means of both torture and execution for individuals convicted of particularly heinous crimes or acts of high treason. The breaking wheel was a large, spoked wheel, often made of wood or iron, resembling a wagon wheel. The condemned person would then be tied to the wheel, either face up or face down, and their limbs would be stretched out and secured to the spokes of the wheel. The executioner would then use a heavy iron bar or hammer to break the victim's bones, often starting with their fingers, toes, and limbs. After the breaking of the bones, the condemned person was left exposed on the wheel, typically in a public place, to die slowly from their injuries, thirst, or exposure to the elements. Death could take a very long and agonizing time, making this method of execution particularly cruel. The breaking wheel was intended not only as a means of punishment, but also as a public spectacle to deter others from committing similar crimes. Head crusher. The head crusher was a torture device used in the late Middle Ages, typically during the Spanish Inquisition. It was designed to cause extreme pain and ultimately death by crushing the skull. This device was a metal cap with a screw mechanism that could be tightened, causing a crushing, vice-like pressure on the head. Here's how the head crusher worked. The victim's chin was placed on the bottom bar and their head rested on a metal cap. A screw located on the top of the device was then turned to lower the upper cap onto the victim's head. As the screw was tightened, the pressure increased on the victim's skull. The pressure would cause severe pain, and over time, it would lead to the crushing of the skull and ultimately death. The head crusher was a particularly gruesome and agonizing method of torture and execution, designed to inflict extreme suffering. It was often used to extract confessions or information from individuals accused of heresy, witchcraft, or other crimes. Decapitation is the act of cutting off a person's head from their body, often used as a method of execution. It has been used as a form of capital punishment in various cultures and throughout history, and it remains a subject of historical, cultural, and legal significance. Here are some of the key points about decapitation. The historical use. Decapitation as a method of execution has been employed in many different societies, often used as a form of punishment for various crimes, including high treason, murder, and acts of rebellion. Also, cultural and religious practices. In some cultures and religions, decapitation has been used in ritualistic practices or as part of specific customs. For example, it has been associated with certain sacrificial rituals in ancient civilizations. Impaling is a gruesome and brutal method of execution in which a person is killed by being pierced through the body with a sharp object, typically a stake, pole, or spear. This form of execution was historically employed in various cultures and time periods for different reasons, including punishment for crimes, public spectacle, and as a means of instilling fear or exerting control. Walling, as a form of punishment or execution, typically involves sealing a person within a confined space, often within a wall, and leaving them to die slowly from starvation, suffocation, or other causes. This method of punishment or execution has been employed in various historical contexts and cultures. As it is cruel and inhumane practice, walling often involved the following steps. The victim would be placed within a small enclosed space, such as a specially constructed wall or a dungeon. The space might be sealed off by bricks, stones, or other materials, effectively entombing the individual. The person was left in the confined space with no means of escape or access to food, water, or fresh air. Death typically occurred over a time period due to starvation, dehydration, suffocation, or other different factors. Walling was used as a method of punishment for various crimes, including treason, heresy, or other forms of dissent or disobedience. It was intended not to only cause death, but also to serve as a public example and to deter others from committing similar acts. The iron chair is a historical torture device that was designed to cause extreme pain and suffering, as all of these on the list. It was used during the Middle Ages and later periods as a means of inflicting punishment, extracting confessions, or simply as a form of sadistic cruelty. The iron chair typically had a design consisting of a chair with a number of spikes or sharp objects, often made of iron, fitted onto the seat, backrest, armrest, and sometimes even the leg rest. The victim would be then forcibly seated into the chair, and their body weight would press against the spikes, causing severe pain and often injury. In some variations, the chair had restraints to prevent the victim from moving or escaping. The specific design of the iron chair varied over time and by region, but the underlying principle was to cause the victim immense physical pain without necessarily causing immediate death. This torture method was particularly effective at inflicting suffering and at times led to long-lasting injuries or even death, depending on the severity of the torture. Republican marriage. This will kind of be like a little history lesson because this wasn't a widely used sort of execution method, but it was just used in a very small part in the French Revolution. And that was during a period known as the Reign of Terror. While there was a disagreement among historians about the start of the Reign of Terror, but it largely refers to September 1793 to July 1794. During the Reign of Terror, there were large-scale massacres and public executions due to revolutionary supporters and resistors, opposition to religious authority, and accusations of treason by the Committee of Public Safety. During this period, it is estimated that at least 300,000 people were arrested and 17,000 people were officially executed, but this number might be much higher. Another 10,000 people were estimated to have died in prison or were sentenced without going to trial. Often, these deaths were cruel and ruthless. The guillotine may have been introduced as a humane way of execution, but other methods employed were far more drawn out and far nastier. Republican marriage, or marriage républicain, was one of these. A brutal form of execution that was said to have occurred in the city of Nantes, in the Loire Alicante of the Loire River of France. A Republican marriage was performed by tying a naked man and a naked woman together and then drowning them in the Loire River. These Republican marriages pair the old with the old, the children with the children, the priests with the nuns, and let them sink to watery graves. And the responsibility for this terrible method of execution rests with one man, Jean-Baptiste Carrère. Death by immolation refers to the act of intentionally setting oneself on fire or being set on fire by others with the intention of causing death. Immolation is a form of self-inflicted or intentional harm that is often used as a form of protest or sacrifice. It has been associated with various social, political, and religious movements throughout history and continues to occur in some regions as a form of extreme protest or martyrdom. One of the most well-known instances of self-immolation is a form of protest occurred during the 1960s in South Vietnam, where Buddhist monks and nuns set themselves on fire to protest the policies of the government. These acts were intended to draw international attention to the religious and political issues of the time. Alright, now into the fifth and final tier, starting off with keel hauling, was a form of maritime punishment that was used in history, particularly among European naval forces. It was a brutal and often deadly method of disciplining sailors. Keel hauling involved dragging the punished individual along the underside of the ship's hull, which was covered in barnacles and other sharp marine growth, as a means of causing severe injury or death. The keel hauling process typically involved the following steps. With being, the offender would be tied to a rope or harness, often with weights attached, to ensure they would sink underwater. The individual would then be lowered over the side of the ship and dragged beneath the vessel, moving from one side to the other. As the person was pulled beneath the ship, they would be scraped and injured by the sharp growth on the hull, suffering injuries, cuts, and often drowning. Keel hauling was used as a form of punishment for a variety of offenses, particularly for sailors found guilty of serious misconduct or mutiny. The process was incredibly dangerous, and many individuals subjected to it did not survive. Rat torture is a gruesome and sadistic method of torture and execution that has been used in different historical periods and regions. It involves the use of rats to torture or punish a person. The basic concept of rat torture typically involved the following steps. A person would be restrained, often by binding them to the ground, a table, or a cage, and then rats, usually hungry or agitated, would be placed on the restrained individual's body. To induce the rats to move, burrow, or escape a source of heat, such as a heated metal or container of hot coals, would be placed near the restrained person. As the rats sought to escape the heat, they would gnaw or burrow into the person's flesh, causing immense pain and often leading to death. The cruelty of this method lies in the fear and the agony it causes, as well as the slow and painful nature of the torture as the rats burrowed deeper into the victim's body. The tongue torture, also known as tongue cutting or lingual torture, is a cruel and painful form of torture that involves inflicting harm on a person's tongue. This form of torture is designed to cause extreme suffering, often with long-lasting or permanent effects on the victim. Tongue torture can involve various methods, including cutting or mutilating the tongue with knives, blades, or other sharp instruments, often resulting in severe bleeding and permanent damage. piercing the tongue with sharp objects such as needles or nails, burning the tongue with hot objects or substances, causing excruciating pain and potential scarring, and crushing the tongue, which can lead to intense pain and potentially permanent disfigurement, nailing or pinning the tongue to a surface, preventing the victim from moving it, speaking, or eating. Tongue torture has been used for various reasons, including as a means of extracting confessions, punishing individuals for alleged crimes or perceived offenses, or as a form of sadistic cruelty. The consequences of tongue torture extend beyond the physical pain, often including psychological trauma and long-term disabilities related to speech and eating. Poena culae was a form of punishment used in ancient Rome. It is often referred to as the penalty of the sack or sack punishment. This method of punishment was reserved for individuals convicted of parricide, which is the act of killing one's parents or close relatives. The punishment of poena culae involved the following steps. The condemned individual was placed inside a large leather sack along with live animals, such as a rooster, a snake, a dog, and a monkey. The sack was then sewn shut, leaving the person and the animals inside. The sack, with its living contents, were thrown into bodies of water, such as a river or the sea. The condemned person would eventually suffocate or drown, while the animals added to the terror and discomfort within the sack. Bamboo torture, also known as bamboo splinters or bamboo shoots torture, is a gruesome and sadistic method of torture that has been reported in some historical and contemporary contexts. The method involves forcing a person to sit or stand on a patch of growing bamboo, which eventually penetrates the body, causing extreme pain and potentially leading to death. The bamboo torture process typically involves the following steps. A person would be restrained in a way that they would not be able to move or escape. Bamboo, which is known for its rapid growth and sharp pointed roots, would be placed beneath the victim. Over time, the bamboo would grow, gradually piercing through the person's body, causing severe pain, injury, and potentially leading to organ damage or death. Bamboo torture is especially cruel and sadistic due to the prolonged suffering and the difficulty of escaping once it begins. The sharp bamboo shoots can penetrate the skin, muscle, and organs, leading to severe internal injuries. Scaphism, also known as the boats, is an ancient method of torture and execution that was described by ancient historians, most notably Herodotus. It is an exceptionally gruesome and brutal form of punishment that involves prolonged suffering and death. The scaphism process typically involves the following steps. The condemned person would be stripped and placed inside a narrow boat or a similar container with their arms, legs, and head protruding. The person would be forcibly fed a mixture of milk and honey to encourage diarrhea, and they would be covered in the same mixture. The boat, with the person inside, would be placed inside a stagnant or slow-moving body of water, such as a swamp or a marsh. Over time, the person would be left exposed to the elements, insects, and the muck of the water. The combination of the cramped quarters, the milk and honey attracts the insects, and the continuous exertion of bodily waste would lead to a painful and agonizing process. Insects would infest the person's body, leading to infection, gangrene, and ultimately death. Scaphism was intended not only to cause death, but also to maximize suffering. It was also used as a means of punishment for particularly heinous crimes or as a form of just, torture. The Judas cradle, also known as the Judas chair, and was a gruesome and torturous device used during the medieval period for inflicting pain and extracting confessions from individuals accused of crimes. This method of torture involved a pointed pyramid-shaped seat with a harness to secure the victim in place. Here's how the Judas cradle worked. The accused person would be stripped and placed in a sitting position over the pointed pyramid seat. The victim's weight would cause the sharp point to penetrate the anus or vagina, causing extreme pain. Torturers might add weights to the victim's ankles or place them to their knees to increase the pressure and pain. The victim would then be subjected to further humiliation, threats, or additional torture to extract confessions or informations. The Judas cradle was designed to cause severe pain and discomfort without causing immediate death, and it was intended to break the will of the accused and force them to confess to their alleged crimes. Crushing by elephant was a gruesome method of capital punishment that was historically used in various regions and cultures, including South and Southeast Asia. This form of execution involves using a trained elephant to kill a person as a form of punishment, typically for particularly heinous crimes of acts of treason. Here's how execution by elephant typically worked. The condemned person would be restrained and brought to a public place where the execution would take place. A trained elephant, often wearing ornamental decorations, would be used as the executioner. The elephant's handler or manhout would guide the animal, and the elephant would be directed to trample or crush the person with its massive weight. This would involve the elephant stepping on its victim, sitting or kneeling on them, or using other means to inflict fatal injuries. The execution was often performed in a public setting to serve as a form of deterrence and to instill fear into the general population. The tiger bench is a form of torture used in some regions, particularly in China. It is a brutal and painful method of punishment that involves forcing an individual to sit on a bench with their legs extended, their knees bent at a 90-degree angle, and their hands tied behind their back. The person's feet do not touch the ground, and they are forced to maintain this agonizing position. Tiger bench torture typically involves the following elements: a rigid bench with restraints. The victim is strapped to a wooden or metal bench that is designed to keep them sitting in place with their knees bent at right angles. Binding of limbs, and the person's wrists are typically tied behind their back, and their ankles are also tied or otherwise restrained and forced to maintain the position. The victim is unable to move or shift their weight, leading to extreme pain and discomfort. This position can be maintained for extreme periods and causing severe physical or psychological suffering. Tiger bench torture is used as a means of punishment, coercion, or extracting confessions from individuals accused of various crimes. The physical pain and prolonged immobility can lead to injuries and long-term physical and psychological harm. Sawing as a method of torture or execution is a gruesome and brutal form of punishment that has been used historically in various cultures and time periods. It typically involves the use of a saw or similar cutting tool to cause extreme suffering or death. The sawing process often includes the following steps. The condemned person would be restrained, typically in a public setting. A large saw, often operated manually or mechanically, would be used to cut through the person's body, typically starting at the groin or abdomen and progressing upward. The process was slow and agonizing, as the saw would cut through the person's flesh, muscle, and bones. Sawing was used as a form of punishment for various crimes, as well as the means of execution. It was intended not to only cause death, but also to maximize suffering. The public nature of this execution was also meant to deter others from committing similar crimes. The hanging cage, also known as the cage of death or the gibbet cage, was a form of punishment and execution used in various historical periods and regions. This method involved placing an individual inside a small cage, often made of iron or wood, and suspending it in a public place, typically from a tall structure such as a gallows or a castle wall. The person inside would be left to die slowly from exposure, starvation, and sometimes the elements. The hanging cage process typically involved the following elements. A person convicted of a crime, often a particularly heinous one, would be placed inside the cage. The cage would then be suspended into a public area, serving as a gruesome, invisible spectacle to the community. The condemned individual would be left to endure harsh weather conditions, lack of food and water, and the psychological torment of being on display. Death in the hanging cage was often slow and agonizing, as the person inside suffered from exposure, dehydration, and the inability to move or escape. The use of the hanging cage was intended not only as a means of execution, but also as a public example and deterrent once again to others who might contemplate committing similar crimes. Over time, as societies became less tolerant of cruel and unusual punishments, the use of the hanging cage was gradually phased out. Tying intestines around a tree. I looked a lot online to anything related to this, and I couldn't, and so I guess it's just tying someone's intestines around a tree. But if anyone finds anything, let me know down in the comments below. Ling Chi, also known as slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts or lingering death, was a particularly gruesome and torturous method of execution that was practiced in China during certain historical periods. It was reserved for individuals convicted of the most serious crimes, including high treason or regicide. Lingizhi involved inflicting a slow and agonizing death on the condemned person, often in a public setting, and here's how Lingzhi typically worked. The condemned person would be bound and secured in a public area, often a marketplace or town square. The executioner would systematically and methodically amputate or remove small pieces of the person's flesh, starting with the limbs and then proceeding to other body parts. The process was intended to prolong suffering and was performed in a specific order, with the goal of causing as much pain as possible. The condemned person would be kept alive as long as possible, and over the period of several hours or even days, while enduring excruciating pain. Lingzhi was not intended to only cause death, but also to serve as a public spectacle to warn others. And alright, that wraps up the brutal punishments iceberg. And I hope you enjoyed to some extent. This was definitely a darker video, but it was interesting to research and see what sort of punishments were utilized in history and stuff like that. So if you're still watching, subscribe. We're almost at 50,000, and thanks for watching. And until next time, see ya.